Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video is going to be a continuation of the Dead Banker Society, which I started yesterday. I think you should make a series out of the dead bankers. I am very enthusiastic when I hear about bankers going bye-bye. You know, like we had Thomas H. Lee go bye-bye in Manhattan on Thursday before lunchtime, around 11 a.m. in his 6th floor office there at 767 5th Avenue, Midtown Manhattan. Yeah, 78 years old. That should be like a shot across the bow for Paul Pelosi. I forgot to mention that Paul Pelosi's actually had 4 close calls with death. Once at age 16 when he flipped over his sports car, killing his older brother David. That was back in 1957, if you remember, in the neighborhood where serial killer Charles Ng went to Notre Dame Academy, where SLA kidnapped victim Patricia Hearst went to school at the Upland Crystal Springs Reservoir School. It's where Sam Bankman-Fried went to school at the Upland Crystal Springs School. Sam Bankman-Fried, no longer Fried. That's where Paul Pelosi killed his older brother, David. In that zip code, right there. I'm not kidding. Then I forgot that just after Abigail Folger got bayoneted 28 times with a NATO M7 bayonet, and her mother, Ines Mejia, who was the hotshot private banker for Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, was in mourning, Paul Pelosi has moved into Presidio Heights, has recently moved into Presidio Heights near University of San Francisco, near Haight-Ashbury, adjacent to the Presidio Army Base and Letterman Hospital and Bioweapons Lab. There's Paul Pelosi and Nancy Pelosi raising their children in Presidio Heights. And on October 11th, 1969, just 2 months after Abigail Folger was put out of business as a private banker, and her mother is on, I guess, mandatory leave of her banking duties, Paul Pelosi's getting organized, and we have Paul Stein, a yellow taxi cab driver, shot in the head with a 9mm pistol at the corner of Washington Street and Cherry Street, just, you know, within a block and a half of where Paul Pelosi lives. He's 29 years old. And Paul Stein, the taxi driver, he's 29 years old, bleeding out on the sidewalk on Washington Street at the corner of Cherry and Washington. The cab was parked on Washington Street, right near the fire hydrant. Dead as a doornail, laying in the front seat of his cab, but the blood running out into the gutter. Yep. All right. Because remember, the Zodiac killer opened the passenger door to take some scissors or a knife and cut some of the shirt fabric from Paul Stein's shirt to be able to mail it to Patricia Hearst's father's newspaper, The Examiner, right? See, it's like CIA on CIA on CIA messaging going on here, where CIA Pelosi family is living in provisional housing right there in Presidio Heights. So that's a kind of a near miss because Paul Pelosi didn't get nicked with a 9mm, but he's living in the neighborhood where Paul Stein was shot in the head with a 9mm, probably from an Army intelligence officer, because that is where the Zodiac killer, the alleged Zodiac killer, who I don't think was the Zodiac, but anyway, it was the media. The media portrayed the killer as walking into Army intelligence base, Presidio Army officer housing, where Sharon Tate's father had a home there. So you got Sharon Tate's father living in Presidio Heights. We got Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, Diane Goldman Feinstein. They're all living there. And then this innocent cab driver, I think, Paul Stein, gets shot in the head with a 9mm. And hey, that could have been Paul Pelosi, but it was Paul Stein. So that's 2. Then we had the Porsche Carrera sports car crash, torpedoing Jesus Lopez on his way home from work on a Saturday night on May 28th, 2022, where nobody died, but both cars were totaled right at the Rothschilds' Jewish Opus 1 vineyard in Oakville off Highway 29, State Highway 29, is the Philippe de Rothschild's Opus 1 winery. And that's where Paul Pelosi crashed into the fence after taking out Jesus Lopez's Jeep. I don't know what you got to do to total a Jeep. It wasn't a Jeep Cherokee. It was a Jeep. So you got a total Jeep. You got a totaled $220,000 Porsche Carrera. You got Paul Pelosi falling down drunk. You got a torn down fence line on the Philippe de Rothschild's Opus 1 winery, which is like $5,000 a bottle of wine to be able to justify the real estate value of that property. All right, you'd have to charge $5,000 a bottle to come close to breaking even. So that's a clandestine service vineyard, right? Which we're pouring aluminum chemtrails over every day from Travis Air Force Base. They're dumping aluminum and titanium and lithium all over that Philippe de Rothschild's vineyard, where Paul Pelosi wrecked his Porsche. Then we had the styrofoam fake hammer attack. I'm assuming it was a styrofoam hammer, because Paul Pelosi is not dead. And they took him to the hospital furthest away from the crime scene, instead of taking him to St. Francis Hospital or over to University of California, San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury. No. I mean, that's just a mile to a mile and a half away. Why would you take him to the other side of South San Francisco, where Abigail Folger is buried at the Colma, Holy Cross Catholic Cemetery? That's where San Francisco General Hospital Zuckerberg face crack is located. It's on the way out of town. And that's where they took Paul Pelosi. So I'm assuming he wasn't in a traumatic way with his head injury, which I believe he didn't have a head injury. And there's no proof that he did. There is zero proof that Paul Pelosi got conked on the head with a hammer like William Holden got conked on the head with a tire iron in his beautiful condominium apartment in Santa Monica back in November 1981. There's a lot of proof on that. All right, so I want to continue on with the bankers. I want to hone in and zero in on Paul Marcinkus, who stood 6'4". Paul Marcinkus was born and raised in Cicero, Illinois. That's where Al Capone set up shop. That's where Jacob Rubenstein, which everybody knows as Jack Ruby, that's where he grew up, and he worked for Al Capone in Cicero, Illinois. That's where Jose Menendez took his first job after leaving Price Waterhouse as a CPA. Jose Menendez, who's CIA out of Havana, Cuba, left Cuba at age 16 to go on to get a scholarship at University of Illinois, Carbondale. Quit, got married, and moved to New York, to Queens, went to Queens College, got a CPA license, worked for Price Waterhouse, for God's sakes, then did a few years of auditing. Then he lands a job as a controller of a container intermodal smuggling company in Cicero, Illinois, where Paul Marcinkus grew up, where Al Capone was doing business, where Jack Ruby came from. That's where Jose Menendez's first job was before he became chief financial officer of Hertz Rent-A-Car back in New York and New Jersey, and then got to work as chief operating officer for RCA, where he was introduced to the pornography business, where he took his fourth and last job. Well, it's his fifth job if you count Price Waterhouse, but he was a controller, chief executive officer of a transportation container company in Illinois, Cicero, Illinois. He was a chief financial officer for Hertz Rent-A-Cars. He was a chief operating officer for Radio Corporation of America in the music and pornography business, but we don't like to say pornography, so we just say music. And then he was hired by Oliver Stone's partners, Mario Kassar and Andrew Vajna, not his real name, Andrus Weidman, Jewish, and he worked for Calricol Pictures as CEO and chairman of Live Entertainment, which was assigned Noam C. Bloom's Caballero Gentleman's Porn Home Video, Caballero Home Video, Gentleman's Home Video Pornography. That's what Jose Menendez was doing. I bring those names up because they're going to be part of the Paul Marcinkus story, believe it or not. So Paul Marcinkus became a priest in the Holy Catholic Roman Church, and what can I tell you? He ends up over in the Vatican City in 1968 working for the IOR. Of all the places in the Catholic Church that Paul Marcinkus found home, it was at the bank, the Swiss bank, IOR, Institute of Religious Studies, also known as the Bank of Vatican. And that is where Paul Marcinkus was introduced to the Holy City, 1968. He was a secretary. Then, 3 years later, he becomes the president. In 1971, Paul Marcinkus becomes the head of the International Institute of Religious Studies for the Catholic Church, known as the Bank of Vatican, with the Swiss guards. You ever wonder why they have the Swiss guards there? They're not guarding the Pope. They're guarding the bank and the bank records and perhaps the secret vault, the catacombs. So Paul Marcinkus is the president of the Bank of Vatican for 18 years, from 1971 through 1989. And during Paul Marcinkus's reign as president of the Bank of Vatican, he had personal friendships with Roberto Calvi, Michele Sindoni, Sicilian. Roberto Calvi is from Milan. Michele Sindoni is from Messina, Sicily, and then Long Island, New York, and became the private banker for the 5 crime families of New York. Michele Sindona. He was president of the Franklin National Bank, now part of Citigroup. If you were wondering what happened to the 5 crime families accounts, it's part of Citigroup. So Jane Fraser would be your contact there. She's the CEO of Citigroup. She's a Scottish woman who was indoctrinated in British intelligence, and then she got a MBA from Harvard and worked for McKinsey consulting firm, just like Jeff Skilling did. That's where all the criminals go. They go to McKinsey. Then she becomes CEO of Citigroup. Anyway, they took over the Michele Sindona and the 5 crime families of New York's accounts over at Citigroup. Just letting you know. It's like same old, nothing really changes much except the names. Last week it was Thomas H. Lee was the banker in the news. Now he's been shunted aside just like Paul Pelosi's hammer attack has been. All right, so Paul Marcinkus, during the time that he was there, he's friends with William Colby, who was the deputy station chief in Rome. He was replaced by William Casey, and William Casey spent time with Paul Marcinkus when William Casey was snuck into the Holy See, and I believe that was to have meetings with the Bank of Vatican people. You know why the CIA is so involved with hosting dinner parties with cardinals and bankers from Switzerland and the Holy See, which William Colby had his wife Barbara hosting parties in Rome, in their home, with cardinals in their personal home. Why would the CIA be so fascinated? Why would James Angleton and Sharon Tate's father, Paul Tate, who was stationed in Verona, Italy, as part of NATO forces, Operation Gladio, and William Colby is in Rome as deputy station chief there for CIA in Rome, and he's hosting parties with the Vatican's cardinals and archbishops. And why is William Casey being brought into the Holy See as CIA director? And the answer is because the Catholic Church is a Swiss bank, it's a money laundering facility, and most importantly, it's a social engineering platform, kind of sort of like Howard Stern's show is, or the Joe Rogan show is, except it's for devout, Catholics who actually believe that the Pope is running the Catholic Church. But I think that the CIA doesn't believe that the Pope runs the Catholic Church. I think a Swiss bank runs the Holy Catholic Church out of Geneva, Switzerland, and London. That's what I think. And the reason I think that is because if you trace the footsteps of Roberto Calvi during his last 72 hours of life, you will find that he visited Geneva, Switzerland, and picked up a passport as a fiat executive by the name of Gianni Calvini. Remember, his name is Roberto Calvi. So they just slightly changed the name to Gianni Calvini, And these names have appeared in Hollywood films, by the way, people. So if they seem familiar, they are. Okay? They've appeared in The Godfather. They've appeared in the movie The International. They've appeared in dozens of other Hollywood films that I forgot the names of. All right, so anyway, Paul Marcinkus was the president of the Bank of Vatican when William Casey was the CIA director under Ronald Reagan. And Paul Marcinkus was the president of Vatican when Admiral Stanfield Turner, United States Navy, was the director of CIA. You may remember that George H.W. Bush was the director of CIA for about 11 and a half months. Let's call it a year. George Bush, H.W. Bush, was CIA director. I mean, you might call me a crackpot, but let's be honest. I mean, George Bush was the director of CIA, and he was the vice president under Ronald Reagan, and he was the president of the United States for 4 years. And he's CIA. He's the only CIA director to supposedly win an election to be the president of the United States. But he was vice president for 8 years. That's 12 years of George H.W. Bush from Yale and the Skull and Bones and the CIA. And he's, you know, in the highest executive branch of government, and he's CIA all the way. You can't deny it. That's 12 years of government service as vice president or president, and he was director of CIA. So don't tell me I'm cuckoo with Cocoa Pops when I tell you that the CIA is running the show. Of course they are. And I believe they're running the Bank of Vatican too, okay? Because I don't think Paul Marcinkus had any banking education. But, you know, it's not necessary for the job. Just like Abigail Folger didn't have any banking experience, neither did Ines Mejia, her mother. And her mother was more important than the bankers on Sand Hill Road that brought you FTX and Alameda Research. I mean, she had as much banking experience as Don Valentine did, or as Eugene Kleiner did, or as Jerome Kohlberg did, although he did work at Bear Stearns for a while. All right, so anyway, what I want to tell you is that there were a number of homicides that occurred during the 18 years that Paul Marcinkus was there. And I'm only going to name a few. I'm going to name 6 homicides. Because, see, if the banker themselves doesn't get killed, all their customers and partners do. That's what we've learned from watching my videos. There's a lot of mendacity and there's a lot of murder in my stories. So the first one I'm going to pick up was the murder of Pope John Paul I. Pope John Paul I, who had previously been an archbishop and the bishop of Venice. But he came from very modest beginnings in the Dolomite Mountains up by the Fedaya Pass and the Pellegrino Pass. I personally went to his hometown. I also went and visited Bologna, where he went to the seminary. And Pope John Paul I, not his real name. I guess you should want to know what his real name was, because you're probably not going to believe me when I tell you. And this is the Pope that was Pope for the 33 Masonic days. 33 days. I think that's a world's record. You have to go back to 1605 to find 3 popes in one calendar year. Anyway, he was born Albino Luciani. Okay, kind of like Lucky Luciano, who that's not his real name either. His name was Charles, or his name was Salvatore Luciana. Salvatore Luciana became Lucky Luciano. And Pope John Paul I was born Albino Luciani. Albino Luciani became Pope John Paul I. And his papacy began on August 26th, 1978. And then someone handed him a cup of tea laced with cyanide, and he went to bed and didn't wake up on September 28th, 1978. And I'm trying to think what age he was. The Pope was rather young, in my opinion, when he died. He was 65 years old. Pope John Paul I, dead as a doornail at age 65 inside the Vatican City. Now, Paul Marcinkus was there. Paul Marcinkus, Archbishop and President of the Bank of Vatican. And guess who else was in the Roman Holy City, the Holy See of Vatican? Well, I'll tell you. Anthony Raimondi, who is Paul Marcinkus' cousin. He's also a member of the Colombo crime family of New York City. Anthony Raimondi. He is supposedly the nephew of Lucky Luciano. Again, Charles Luciano also goes by Salvatore Luciana. You should know that Lucky Luciano wasn't so lucky. He got murdered. At age 64, 1 year earlier than the Pope. He died on January 26th, 1962 in Naples, a port city. A port city. You notice in my stories, a lot of people get whacked in port cities, like San Pedro, Long Beach, Manhattan Beach, Culver City. It's near Long Beach. Like the Port of Oakland, where Huey Newton was murdered, 3 blocks from the gate of the container yard. Like the Port of San Francisco, when we had one. That's where Charles Sullivan, the guy who controlled the lease for the Fillmore Auditorium, which backs up to the Scottish Rites Masonic Temple, he got shot in the head in the port of San Francisco outside the gates in the Summer of Love on August 2nd, 1967. Summer of Love. Charles Sullivan went bye-bye. I'm sorry, I'm digressing. So Paul Marcinkus was present at the Holy City when Pope John Paul drank some tea and died at age 65. He was fit as a fiddle, and if you visited his hometown, you'd realize how fit you had to be at 8,000 feet elevation on a cliff. Every day you get exercise. Also, Paul Marcinkus was president of the Bank of Vatican when his friend Roberto Calfi was murdered by an orange rope with a love knot, with 15 pounds of bricks in his pockets in his Italian suit, hung from underneath the scaffolding of the Blackfriars Bridge over the River Thames, facing the center of London. And all of those nefarious private bankers in the center of London, not too far from the Tavistock Institute, not too far from where Judy Garland was murdered in 1969 before Sharon Tate was murdered. All right, so then the next thing that happened after Roberto Calfi, who had a passport in his pocket by the name of Gianni Calvini, he also had $15,000 worth of currency in Swiss francs, French francs, Italian lira, London pound sterling notes, and United States dollars. It's kind of a Masonic message that you would have money in 5 of the world's currencies. Italian lira, because Roberto Calfi was Italian, Northern Italian, and so he had lira. That was before the euro. And then he had Swiss francs because he works for Swiss banks. And then he has United States dollars because he works for the CIA. And he has pound sterling because he works for British intelligence. And he has French francs because Geneva, Switzerland is in France. So, and that's CIA. That's the home for the WHO and the Red Cross. The world, Lake Le Monde, Lake Geneva, the world. That's why the WHO is there. That's why it's a banking hub. Geneva, it's the world. Central bank digital currency. Geneva. WHO. Red Cross. They paid Lee Oswald's rent was paid by the Red Cross in Minsk, Russia. Did you know that? The Red Cross, out of Geneva, Switzerland, gave free housing to Lee Oswald when he was sheep-dipped as a Russian spy. The next thing that happened after Roberto Calfi's murder-suicide was Emmanuelle Orlandi, who's age 15. She goes missing and never is found again. She was 8 years old when John Paul I was murdered. You should know that Emmanuelle Orlandi's father worked for Paul Marcinkus at the Bank of Vatican, so her whole family lived inside the Holy See. Anyway, so she went missing. This is more than just a little girl going missing. This is a personal friend of Paul Marcinkus, and she goes bye-bye permanently. And he's implicated in her kidnapping, and he's implicated in her murder. I'm not going to get into that in this video. And The next thing that happens is Michele Sindona, again, who's the private banker for the 5 Cram families of New York, and the president of Franklin National Bank of Long Island, part of Citigroup. He gets handed a cup of cappuccino laced with cyanide, and that's absolutely a fact. And he's murdered on March 22nd, 1986, inside a woman's prison. All right? So let me add up these murders here. I got Paul Marcinkus has run the show for the Bank of Vatican. The Pope is murder-suicided. Roberto Calfi is murder-suicided. Emmanuel Orlandi is kidnapped and has never turned up in the last 50 years, so I'm going to call that a murder. And Paul Castellano, he's murdered at the Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan, New York on December 16th, 1985. Paul Marcinkus knew Paul Castellano, and he was very close with Michele Sindona, who gets whacked next. 3 months after Paul Castellano is murdered with bullets at Spark Steakhouse, Michele Sindona is given the cyanide cappuccino. That's 5. And then I got one more. Jose Menendez is murdered at age 45 at 722 North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills in a home that he didn't reside in with his wife Kitty. And he's in the pornography business working for the CIA. Jose Menendez. And his $15 million of life insurance that his business partners, Mario Casar and Andrew Vachna, hold on his life. His 2 sons got $400,000 to split in a term policy. So there's not much financial motive for Lyle and Eric Menendez to kill their father when his business partners had $15 million of life insurance and worked for social engineering, CIA, Hollywood. So Paul Marcinkus was the president of the Bank of Vatican when Jose Menendez from Cuba, originally, was murdered professionally with shotgun bullets in his rental house, which Elton John and Michael Jackson had lived in prior to him, and William Link of Colombo moved into after they remodeled it, to clean up the crime scene, and then Colombo's creator moves in, right? So that's a cult ritual house that nobody really lives in. It's a rental with junky furniture, kind of like Cielo Drive, right? And this is very close walking distance to where Ben Bugsy Siegel was murdered with a military M1 semi-automatic rifle 3 blocks from Peter Falk's house, and Lionel Barrymore, Jimmy Stewart, Lucille Ball, Jack Benny. They're on Roxbury Drive to the north in Benedict Canyon, and Jose Menendez was killed to the east. Like 4 or 5 blocks away. It's probably 5 blocks, but it's within 1 mile of Ben Siegel's house. Within a mile is 722 North Elm Drive. You can Google that and figure it out on your own. It's not that far. I just thought you should know that just because last week we had Thomas H. Lee blow his brains out on his 6th floor office in Manhattan, which I find very difficult to believe personally. These bankers are narcissists, and they don't want their secretaries to see their heads blown over with brain parts on their artwork on the wall. They would use, first of all, they would prefer to be murdered, which I believe that's what happened. I believe he was murdered in his office. And there are security cameras, and, the killer would have walked in and out, and he'd be on tape. But it'll go missing, and no one's going to look at any security cameras, just like the Paul Pelosi, incidents. There is film and audio recording of the 9/11 call, and they won't release it. So you're never going to hear about whether Paul Pelosi had a passenger in his Porsche Carrera sports car or not. They're not going to release it. And you're not going to see the surveillance video for Thomas H. Lee's murder-suicide Thursday last, 23rd of February. That's 2/23/23. February 23rd, 2023. 2/23/23. Got it? Got it. All right, so to recap, Paul Marcinkus lived until age 84. He lived in Sun City, Arizona, golfing and presiding over Mass at the Catholic Church in Sun City. He did not get whacked. However, his people he knew, Pope John Paul I, whacked at age 65, Roberto Calfi, whacked at age 62, Paul Castellano, whacked at age 70, Michele Sindona, whacked at age 66, Emmanuel Orlandi, I think murdered at age 15, Jose Menendez was 45 when he was murdered by shotguns. I don't know that Paul Marcinkus knew him. I believe it's very possible he did know him, because guess what? Jose Menendez was working for the container company in Cicero when Paul Marcinkus was in Cicero, Illinois as well. So what I'm telling you is that Paul Marcinkus and Jose Menendez were in the same zip code for 3-4 years. So it would be hard to believe that they wouldn't know each other, since they both were affiliated with the clandestine services. All right, that's my video for today. Please hit the like and subscribe, and stay tuned. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.